everyone. We're going to give people just a few more minutes to join. So we will get started shortly. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're going to give everyone a couple more minutes, and then we will get the program started. Looking forward to it. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Garland Reed, and I am a board member of Quality Care for Children and an attorney at Delta Airlines. In addition, I am a mother of 3 who suffered postpartum depression after the birth of my 3rd child. It was important to me to moderate this panel today and present this information to you so that you can understand how to identify postpartum depression, whether you're suffering it or a loved one is, as well as to know the tools and the resources that are available to help you through. Today's Georgia Parent Power webinar topic, Empowering Mothers Navigating Postpartum Depression, is brought to you today by our leading corporate sponsor, Carter's. For over 10 years, Carter's support has helped us provide information and resources to families. Thank you for joining us today. If you are a parent or family member seeking quality-rated childcare and after school, call our 877-ALL-GA-KIDS referral line to talk to a specialist to receive free referrals for care in your community. That is 877-ALL-GA-KIDS or 877-255-4254. You may also search online at www.qualityrated.org. If you're watching this later on YouTube, go ahead and like and subscribe. If you're interested in learning more about what we're doing, please click on that notification bell so you never miss a Georgia Parent Power session with Quality Care for Children. As you may know, the mission of Quality Care for Children is to create a system that equips families and child care providers with the knowledge and resources to nurture and educate Georgia's infants and young children. This webinar is dedicated to addressing the critical issue of postpartum depression among parents in Georgia and in the United States. We recognize the challenges that many individuals may face during this vulnerable period, and we aim to provide insights, resources, and support to help them navigate their mental health journey. Through engaging discussions, expert presentations, and practical tools, we hope you will gain a deeper understanding of postpartum depression, learn effective coping strategies, and discover pathways to seeking help without shame or judgment. Together, we can foster a community of empathy, support, and healing for parents across Georgia. At this time, I would like to introduce our fantastic panelists today. First, I am going to read a short bio of Dr. Dugner Davis. She holds a PhD in developmental psychology from Georgia State University, and she has been a faculty member within the Department of Psychology at Clayton State since August of 2006. She regularly teaches courses on child development and infancy, and her courses on infancy explore maternal and infant health disparities and factors that can improve well-being for caregivers and babies. In addition, we have Ms. Kamaria Excel. Ms. Excel is a Black queer feminist, a doula, and a social worker with a decade of experience in reproductive justice, harm reduction, and developing models of community care. Kamaria leverages her diverse social work background to create affirming spaces, guiding individuals through healing from and thriving in spite of interpersonal trauma and interlocking systems of oppression. Her approach to this work is centered around cultivating a life of pleasure, joy, and holistic wellness. Committed to lasting change, she utilizes decolonial practices and non-Western healing modalities to dismantle structural barriers and promote equity with an emphasis on Black, Indigenous, and people of color and the LGBTQIA+ communities. She is the founder and lead clinician at Kitchen Counter Social Work. Thank you both for being here today and sharing your insight on this critical issue of postpartum depression among mothers in Georgia and the United States. We're so fortunate to have your expertise, your thoughtfulness, and your kindness, and I'm so excited to hear from you today. We will be dividing our conversation into 3 sections. First, we're going to ask our panelists some general questions about postpartum depression. Afterwards, we'll ask them questions that we've received from parents who registered for this event. And lastly, we'll pick questions from our Q&A section of this webinar. If you have a question, remember to leave your question in the Q&A and not in the chat so we can make sure that we see it. All right, with those introductions, let's get started. The first question is going to be for you, Dr. Dugner Davis. What is postpartum depression and what are the symptoms?
All right, first, thanks for having me here today. I'm excited to be part of this conversation. It's obviously a really important topic. Postpartum depression is basically a major depressive episode that happens after the birth of a baby. And so timing is what has historically been used to distinguish postpartum depression from depression more generally. Now, having said that, a lot of healthcare practitioners and people who care about parents have started really talking about we need to broaden our focus to just more generally thinking about maternal mental health, and that depression can emerge during pregnancy, and that in general what we want to be thinking about is the symptoms that somebody might be experiencing and how long they've been experiencing them, and timing in conjunction with the pregnancy should not somehow restrict receipt of services or referral for services. So when we're thinking about a major depressive episode, somebody is experiencing lots of feelings of hopelessness, feeling sad. It is worth noting that with teenagers, sometimes depression can be exhibited through irritability. So if you're talking about a teen mom and they seem really, really cranky, that can be a red flag. Loss of interest in activities, and so that may include engaging with the baby, feeling guilty, feeling worthless, decreased energy. So all of these symptoms are indicators of depression. And in terms of thinking about, well, how is that different from what we sometimes hear about in terms of the baby blues? Really try to focus on the duration of the symptoms and the intensity of the symptoms. So if you've been having these symptoms for more than about 2 weeks, that's time enough to say, hey, let me go on and get some help. Don't let it go for longer. Don't try and, power through. Don't try to kind of just deny that you're in a bad spot. There are lots of screening tools available that should be utilized by your healthcare providers and by your baby's healthcare providers. So ask for a screening. Worst case scenario, if you don't meet the threshold for a full-blown diagnosis of depression, you still can get referred for support services. I mean, that you don't have to meet some sort of magical criteria to get some support and assistance.
Thank you so much. That was really insightful. Ms. Excel, I have the next question for you, although you can also feel free to add any symptoms that you see that are different than what Dr. Dugner Davis has mentioned or in addition to what she's mentioned. But what triggers postpartum depression? Like, what are potential triggers for it?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, and super honored to be here today and speaking about this important topic. I love this question, and I think it's so important to answer in two different ways. And so the first way is to really think about the macro level, right, factors that are at play when it comes to postpartum depression. And why I say that is because looking at the larger social fabric really helps to destigmatize so much of what is happening for an individual mom or parent, right? Oftentimes when we talk about postpartum depression and we just focus on the interpersonal ways that it's showing up, it reinforces that feeling of I'm doing something wrong, or I made a mistake, or I'm unfit. And so we really want to push back on that. And a part of my work is really to say, like, hey, look at the larger world around you and how, our culture is not fit to support moms and parents, right? And so grounding us in the definition of reproductive justice, which is the right to remain in bodily autonomy, to have a child, to not have a child, and to parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. If folks are facing housing insecurity, if they don't have access to clean water, if they're worried about where they're going to get their next meal, or the general safety of their child, right? Those are major socioeconomic factors that are at play, right? When your social determinants of health are at question, how could you not feel very strong feelings about that particular place that you find yourself in? Also, we know that there are really unattainable and restrictive gender expectations of women and birthing folks post-birth, right? So it's like, yeah, you've had this baby, but like, if you're partnered, you still have your duties of your marriage or your partnership. We know that women are still active participants in the labor and the workforce, right? Where they're getting underpaid and overworked. And so, right, feminist theorists have this phrasing, which is perfect, of the second shift, right? So you're in the labor force, you go to your 9 to 5, you do your work, and then you come home, and then there's all the mom duties that you're still bound to, right? There's all the childcare things. So those are, the larger social fabric triggers that I see showing up most heavily for people. Now, when we take that down to the interpersonal, we know that folks having a history already of anxiety, depression, PTSD is going to, of course, be compounded, right, once baby comes earthside. I also my background is in sexual violence prevention and support for folks. And so work with a lot of moms who also have an experience of sexual violence that then after having baby feels really ruptured in their system. So that's another interpersonal one that's also really important to mention is sleep deprivation. And no other time of someone's life do we highly encourage and support the notion that you're not going to get any sleep, right? And not to say that the beginning of, parenting isn't stressful, right? But that is sort of ethos that society supports. Like, you're going to be tired and you're not going to have any time, and you should just deal with that, right? That's the message that we get, versus like, what are the community systems at play that can help support you in getting rest and care? That ties into no self-care practice. We think that, postpartum, it's almost oxymoronic to be talking about self-care, right? Because the whole, Western connection to motherhood is that you should be selfless, right? You should be self-sacrificial because now you have a child, right? And that's where your identity hinges. So those are major ones. And then also just this general feeling of I should know this, or I should know how to do this, or why didn't it just click, right? We get all these and not to say some of them don't hold a little bit of truth, but these ridiculous notions of a maternal instinct that is just supposed to just kick in magically, right? And what I find for people, as my work as a doula and also as a therapist, when people don't have that magic click, it brings them a lot of shame, right? Because we get all these messages about you're supposed to know how to do it. You're supposed to know how to be a mom, even though you've never been a mom. And children don't come with instruction manuals, although I'm sure, it might be great if they did, but there's a lot of learning, right, happening, and shame that comes when folks don't inherently know something. So those are larger macro bird's eye triggers, and then, down to the kind of micro and interpersonal of how it shows up, in particular, folks' bodies and their experiences.
That makes a lot of sense. And I do think, shame can definitely play a role with respect to finding help and really understanding what's going on and not necessarily realizing it's a problem that can be addressed and managed just like anything else. So can you tell me some of the coping mechanisms that people can use if they think they have postpartum depression or they might be trending in that direction?
Right. Yeah. So one of the major things that I find is really helpful is to honor the postpartum period. Um, that is not something that is a part of a Western lens, but if we think about, even Latin American cultures where we have the cuarentena, which is the first 40 days, or other Afro and indigenous cultures where we acknowledge that this is a major change that just happened to the body, right? Neurochemically, physically, there have been major changes that have occurred. Something that I tell folks in the work that I do is also understanding that pregnancy is a very warm state of being, right? Your energy systems are working double time. There's another body. There's a lot more blood flowing energetically, right? It's warmer versus, pregnancy versus, postpartum or, abortion, which are colder states of being, right? Something is being expelled from the body. And so focusing on warming up the body, right? Herbs and soups and teas that really give, mama or parent that nutrients back, right? So sometimes we forget to think about even nourishment as a part of a coping mechanism of getting people back centered and rooted. Other things is really emphasizing the fact that it takes a village, right? We put so much strain on a nuclear family unit that, the two parents have to have all the answers. But I think one of the most powerful coping mechanisms is leaning on a larger community support system. So everyone wants to come over and see the baby, right? Everyone gets really excited about that. Oh, new little human in the family. And what I say to the folks that I work with is, and everyone, has to bring a dish, right? So much about what's helpful in this kind of like frame is that you have to delegate, right? So say, yeah, you can come over, but you got to bring a dish because we need dinner, right? Back to those gender roles, because many folks who, are moms are still having to cook dinner and make meals, right? For either, their partner, or also if they have other toddlers or tiny humans. And so really putting the folks in your community, giving them a task and a job. So if you're going to come over, mom needs to take a nap, or we need to have the laundry done, right? So very practical task for your community. Doulas also, right? Like I can never say enough. And we know that the data shows that midwives of color and doulas of color are actually been instrumental in reverting our terrible maternal health culture in this country, right? Where in the state of Georgia, Black mamas are 2 times more likely to die than their white counterparts, right? We need doulas and midwives of color as a part of the solution. And so, you could just have a postpartum doula, someone who's going to come over in the evening or nighttime to make sure that you can get rest and sleep and care as your baby's still being supported, right? And that in itself is not selfish, right? Just because you're not the only one doing it, you're not stubborn, you're not a bad mom, you're not mean, you're not doing it wrong. And the last thing I'll say is new moms groups, right? Getting in touch with a community so that are, budding over Facebook chats for moms. There's apps like the Earth app and Willomi that were founded by Black women to address this racial health disparity in postpartum. And there's also ones like Peanut, right? Where there's like community forums and blogs and information. And that normalizes, right? When we can visibly see that other people are holding this as an experience, it takes away the shame, right? When we have webinars and panels like this, it destigmatizes the experience. So those are some of my favorite coping mechanisms for, supporting folks who are navigating postpartum.
It's really great. Thank you so much. So Dr. Dugner Davis, do providers miss opportunities in asking women about depression while pregnant and soon thereafter? And how can a provider help a woman once the provider has identified that she has an issue?
You're still
I believe you're on mute, Dr. Dugner Davis.
Sorry, thank you. So providers definitely do miss opportunities. So there are basic, standards of care that obstetricians are supposed to be following, and one of which is doing these postpartum depression screenings. But even with those really explicit, cut and dry standards, about 1 in 8 women report that they've never had a postpartum depression screening during their healthcare visits. And in terms of the rate of postpartum depression, we're seeing about an equivalent number of women have postpartum depression. So this is a very common issue. The 1 in 8 women, we've got a lot of women on this call right now. So 1 in 8 women have the potential to be experiencing postpartum depression. And so when we see that healthcare providers are not doing just kind of the basic standard in terms of screenings, you know there's going to be gaps in terms of accessing services. So women sometimes need to advocate for themselves, which is hard, especially if you are feeling depressed. But try to have these conversations before the baby shows up in terms of like, hey, post-birth, how are you going to help me navigate this? You know, do you do these screenings regularly? If not, can you refer me to a care provider who will provide this service? So, you know, educating yourself on the front end, educating those people who are part of your support system. So your parenting partner, if you have one, the rest of your family, making sure that this is something that is on their radar as far as like, hey, you know, this is something we should be mindful of and attentive to. Lots of times women and parents in general are better about accessing services for their kids and being proactive about services for their kids. So taking advantage of that, pediatricians are supposed to be screening for this also. So that's another context in which parents should feel empowered to say, hey, I know this is a well baby check, but I'm not feeling good and I need a depression screening. And knowing that you can seek out support and services even if maybe you don't meet every single criteria for a major depressive episode, that does not need to be the gold standard for saying, hey, I can use some support here. In general, I would like to kind of echo and amplify so many of the things that Ms. Excel has already said. The United States presents a very distinct landscape with respect to supporting parents or not supporting parents. Our paternal leave policies are really, really out of sync with pretty much every other nation in the world. And you mentioned how hard it is for birthing people to have to engage in that second shift. That is a really, really big dynamic in the United States. And there's a lot of work that backs up the idea that how much leave you have post a baby's birth is a direct predictor of your risk factors for postpartum depression. And so knowing that on the front end, you can't necessarily change your work landscape, but you can make it clear that you need to be more proactive about, okay, what kind of resources can I put in place? Because I know my workspace is not going to be very supportive. So there's a lot about the context in which people are parenting in the United States that makes it a uniquely hard task. Our care providers are not as diligent as they need to be. And that gets amplified by systemic racism in terms of who we're not providing services to. A lot of policy landscape is not supportive of parents. So parents, unfortunately, need to kind of arm themselves and recognize that landscape. And I'm not saying and just power through, but try to think about, okay, what resources can I access to try and mitigate this is the context in which I'm parenting.
Those were very thoughtful and very insightful comments. And I saw, Ms. Excel, I saw you nodding your head several times. Did you want to add anything, or you were just nodding for emphasis?
No, just, yeah, I think Dr. Dugner Davis like hit it so on the head. Yeah, the lack of time parents get, the lack of empathy, support. So yeah, nothing to add, just heavy emphasis. That's
great. So we'll move on to the next question. We've talked about, identifying postpartum depression, tools that you can use. I know for me, I also use medication to help me through my episode. Can you tell us some of the stories of resilience and recovery from mothers who've had postpartum depression? Do you have any good examples that you can share with us, Ms. Excel?
Yeah, I think some of the most powerful stories are when folks give themselves the permission, right, to be really holding this experience, right, versus like resisting that it's happening. And so much of that is compounded, right, by what I've said, what Dr. Dugner Davis has already said, and not rushing, right, because sometimes we rush to fix, right, and in the culture we live in, it's right, this is the issue, go, fix it, power through, get on top of it. But this is something that I find when folks give themselves the space, the breath, the moment to understand what is fully happening to them. For me, that's a part of resilience. When folks are feeling empowered to ask for help, to ask for care and support, that is resilience. When people begin to be selfish, and I don't call it selfish, right? I think larger culture would call it selfish, right? Because, considering the context and the moment, right? You're supposed to be self-sacrificial at this point. But when people say, hey, I actually really do need you to come over and just watch the baby, right? Or if you have other little ones, right? Or take the toddler for a walk in the park. Like, I just need a moment, right? I just need a break. When people do that, especially when it gets to the point where it becomes unapologetic, and oftentimes in my work with people, I can just see there's change in their mood, right? And the change in how they're holding their bodies and how they're coming into the space, and boundaries. Like, when I hear people being like, hey, so-and-so did this, and I said, I don't appreciate that. Or, hey, if you continue that, I'm going to have to pull back in this particular way. Because it's hard, right? Where people are coming over and in your space. And once again, I always emphasize for folks, like, you have the right to be fully autonomous, right? And how you raise your children, and wanting to be protective and intentional about that container. And sometimes, right, intergenerationally, that ruffles a couple feathers and makes people feel a particular kind of way. But for me, it really shows the dedication that folks have to their wellness and to their, right, that trickles down to how they care and are intentional about their baby's support. So those are like larger themes for me when I think about resilience and overcoming, and understanding that sometimes once we just give something the light and the attention that it needs, to your point, Garland, about, taking the medication because it feels in alignment, or asking for the support, like the timing on the back end kind of fizzles away. Things kind of fall into place once we, call this thing out and make ourselves aware of it. So that's what I think of when I am considering resilience.
No, absolutely. I mean, I found for me, being aware what was going on and realizing that there were resources available to me, whether it was people, a helping hand, medication, family members, talking to someone, all of those resources have really put me on a positive path for the rest of my life, like learning through this. And that's why I'm so compelled to share, because I think this is important for women and their partners and birthing parents to know that this happens. If neither one of you have anything to add on this topic, we're going to move over to just some scenarios that were asked by parents. My first one is for you, Dr. Dugner Davis. My friend just had her second baby. I think I'm noticing some signs and symptoms of postpartum depression, but I don't know how to approach the topic with her. What can I do to be a supportive friend and not overstep boundaries?
So in general, culturally, I think we need to get over the idea of not overstepping boundaries, that I think we need to embrace kind of a radical willingness to step up and speak up when we're concerned about our loved ones. So I think just, really framing it in the context of, I love you and I'm concerned about you. And hey, this is what I'm noticing. But also asking a lot of questions, asking a lot of open-ended questions. How are you feeling? How are you sleeping? What are you eating? When was the last time you took a nap? When was the last time you had 10 minutes by yourself? Thinking about when you're initially having this conversation, being in a place that's conducive to talking and being supportive, and being a really active listener. But just also in general, that these are not things that we should be shy to talk about. I actually just last night stumbled across a new public health campaign by Megan Thee Stallion called Seize the Awkward, which is all about go on and have that conversation. Don't sit by as somebody's drowning and be like, oh, it might be awkward if I say, hey, do you need a life float? So just get in there, start the conversation. It doesn't have to be perfect. I mean, there are no perfect words for this. Just say, hey, I'm worried. I can find some resources for you. We can find some resources together. There are resources out there, but get the conversation going and then keep the conversation going so that it's not a one-shot deal. And if the person doesn't seem completely receptive that first time, that you back off. Just be like, hey, I'm here again. I'm back, and I'm checking up on you. So that you kind of normalize the fact that I care about your well-being.
That's fantastic. And I love what you just said about like asking someone if you need a drowning person, if you're going to throw them a life vest. That's exactly what it's like. And sometimes people don't realize they're drowning, you know, and it takes an outside perspective to help them. Scenario 2 is going to be for you, Miss Excel. I am a first-time mom and I have to go back to work in 2 weeks. I'm currently experiencing postpartum depression and feel very anxious about returning to work. What can I do to cope with this transition?
Yeah, great question. I mean, that goes back to like, right, Dr. Dugner Davis's point about like time, right, and leave, and oftentimes how it's so not equitable. And if we think about like other cultures having up to 6 months, right, or a year, right, to fully immerse themselves with their baby, it's egregious what we have here. But first thing that I do is really to encourage some somatic body-based attention, right? So leaning into practices such as breath work, mindfulness, grounding, things that, you know, as you are entering back into that space, you can do to call yourself back to your body, especially right when you're not going to be home anymore and baby's going to be far away from you. Of course, that is so normal to have anxiety about that. So calling you back to the body, calling you back to yourself, and see if there's like intentional practices. Routine making could be helpful as you're leading up to that 2 weeks, or as you're leading up to whatever time you have when you go back to work, getting yourself and your, you know, family unit in a state of flow so that you kind of know what's happening when. Really clear conversations with your, once again, your village or your partner about expectations and what it looks like and means that you're going back to work, right? What are your fears about that? What are, you know, loose ends that feel like they need to be not necessarily, you know, wrapped, tie in a bow, but that you need to address before you enter back into the workspace. I also want to acknowledge too that sometimes going back to work is what really awakens people to that they're experiencing some of these symptoms, right? Now that you're back in that fast-paced 9-to-5 working environment, it's like, oh, wow, I'm not okay, right? So being kind and gentle to yourself and really having a practice of noticing what's changing and what's occurring. Next thing I'll say is to speak to your HR department, especially, I always encourage HR versus a direct supervisor, right? Because things, and that dynamic can sometimes get a little finicky or off, but specifically in the state of Georgia, a lot has happened this summer when it comes to Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, especially in June, right? There are new guidelines that were released. So I really encourage folks, and that's a resource you're gonna get after the panel as well, but to look at those guidelines that organizations, companies, wherever you work, have to give flexible workplace accommodations for pregnant folks, as well as people who are in the postpartum period. So being very clear about things that you need. Also, there's so much shame that comes with pumping also, and considering how to navigate that in the workspace, right? I've worked through a lot of times with people when they talk about, hey, I was pumping and I got this comment, or there are no places for me to privately pump in my office. So I have to do it like in the bathroom over the toilet, and that makes me uncomfortable. So having those conversations about what that might look like. Once again, tapping into that care network, community members, as well as professionals who can support, and never underestimating the power of building community with other moms, support groups, and you know, things like latching organizations that help with breastfeeding, right? Thinking about specialized care and seeking out, based on a particular issue that you have, folks who are doing that work so that it feels like a more smooth transition. And also to acknowledging that even when doing all these things, that some symptoms might not be immediately alleviated, right? That it hurts to leave your baby, and that's okay. And that's normal to feel that pain or frustration.
So much. I see, Dr. Dugner Davis, that you had something you also wanted to add to this particular scenario.
Yeah, I wanted to, again, kind of piggyback on one of Ms. Excel's comments with respect to talking to your HR division. Also have your parenting partner talk to their HR division. The way the Federal Family Medical Leave Act is structured, the father or the parenting partner, whoever else is on the birth certificate, is eligible for leave also. And often that is not a resource that gets utilized. We don't have a lot of resources here in terms of leave time in the United States for new parents. And so personally, I feel extremely strongly that people should be taking advantage of what little they get, and that if you got to go back to work, sometimes it can alleviate some of the stress of that transition if you know that the baby's at home with your partner, at least for some period of time. So make sure that you are aware of the rights that you have and that you're utilizing them to the greatest extent possible.
Those are really excellent points. And, I will add, depending on your place of employment, they may have some mental health or other resources that are available through your benefits program that you hadn't noticed before because you didn't think that you were going to need them. So that's also something to check before you go back to work. I have, another scenario. And this one I'm going to ask to you, Dr. Dugner Davis. I'm a single mother of a newborn and I just moved to Georgia. I have no friends or family around me and I feel very isolated and I don't feel connected to my baby. Who do I reach out to for help? And how can I?
So I would start with your pediatrician, that this is something you should let the pediatrician know, especially in terms of this scenario, as far as I'm not feeling connected with my baby, because that's really going to impact what's going on developmentally with your infant. So let the pediatrician go. But then there are a whole lot of resources, local and international resources. So there is Postpartum Support International. There's a Georgia chapter for that. The Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies Coalition of Georgia has a ton of resources. There's an organization called Mesh Moms, which is Moms Empowered with Support and Humor. As I said, I would start with your pediatrician, but there are a lot of resources out there that are specifically geared toward providing that kind of, put your arms around each other and support one another. Ask your best friend to do some of the legwork. So if you're feeling really isolated, even if you're your best friend out of town, be like, I need you to get online and find some resources for me. So if you're here by yourself, hopefully you still have some connections and contacts where you were and take advantage of them, but also know that they're there and start searching.
That's fantastic. Those were a lot of resources that I wasn't even aware of. So thank you so much for sharing that with us today. Ms. Excel, I have another scenario for you. What is the stigma in ethnic communities surrounding mental health in Georgia in relation to postpartum depression? And how can parents overcome barriers to accessing help for postpartum depression?
Such an excellent question. I would say some of the initial stigmas that I think about when I hear this question is, we have these strong Black women stereotypes, right? And many of my clients identify as Black, Indigenous, folks of color. And so it's something I hear all the time of I can't ask for help, or where do I turn? Or are people going to believe me, right? There's also this kind of notion of who is seen as credible or valid in their pain and in their vulnerability. And we know most times that Black women are not given that privilege to fall apart and to have a moment where they're really asking for help. So, Dr. Dugner Davis's point about, Meg the Stallion's campaign is timely and crucial, right? Of really pushing back on that stigma, both in our community, right? We know it happens, but also externally. And so helping folks to feel empowered that even with those markers of identity, you are worthy and deserving of support and care. I'll also say that, a way that compounds with larger systems of oppression is that we know that folks of color are overrepresented even within CPS investigations when folks say, hey, I need support, or I don't know what to do, or I was really frantic in this moment and I caught this number. And now folks have, systems policing in their lives that are surveilling them. And so, yes, it's an issue of being able to say what's happening with you, but then also, right, always going back to that macro, which I feel like is so important to look at the social factors of then how that is deemed wrong, and people get punished and penalized for needing care and support. So I think, you know, those macro issues of like inner community asking for care, and also too the, you know, historically, both the medical system as well as the mental health systems have not responded well to folks of color when we say, hey, I am having a mental health issue, or I am breaking down rapidly and I need care, right? That tends to be more surveilled. And so it's important to find a provider that is culturally aware, culturally competent, that understands nuances of your culture and looks like you, right? Oftentimes in my work, people are like, oh my God, you do this work and you look like me, and it's not stigmatizing. Oh my goodness. So connecting with folks like Black Mamas Matter Alliance, which is based in Atlanta, Georgia, and has a whole alliance of community-based organizations of color that focus on these particular issues. So it's not, you know, to Dr. Davis's point about saying the quiet part out loud, right? Saying the awkward thing. We don't even have to do that, right? We know we can have those open and fluid conversations. And something else I'll say is to this, you know, scenario that was just previously talked about, separation from community, right? When you don't have people around you, and you're in isolation, which we know in the midst of this pandemic is continuously occurring, where people are pushed away from those networks of support. And so I say really look at the work that is being done nationwide, in Georgia specifically. Sister Love Inc., right, as another organization in Georgia, 9 to 5 chapter there is very active and involved, and begin to seek out or reach out for support with people who are doing that work.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing about that and for providing those resources for everyone on our call today. I have one more scenario for you, Dr. Dugner Davis. My partner and I were so excited to welcome our new baby. Now that the baby is here, I'm struggling to connect with the baby and my wife, and I'm feeling irritable. Is it possible to experience postpartum depression as a father and non-birthing parent?
Yep, most definitely. And the rates of paternal postpartum depression are only slightly lower than the rates of maternal postpartum depression. So about 1 in 8 women experience postpartum depression, 1 in 10 dads. So it's really not that different. And I would suggest that difference is probably due to underreporting. So as many barriers as moms experience in terms of getting diagnosis and services, the dads are even less hooked in with those resources. So yes, it definitely is something that fathers can encounter. And as we've discussed elsewhere, working your resources, working your support systems, reaching out, knowing that this does happen. It's not some sort of one-off weird thing that it's just happening to you. A lot of dads go through this transition. And this has been alluded to previously, but there's been so many changes over the past couple of decades with respect to family size, connection with extended families. Most people as parents have had minimal experience taking care of a baby, and that is particularly true for dads. And so the transition to parenthood is not one that's spontaneous. It's not one where people are just like, oh, I know how to do this. And so the stress associated with it is significant. And a lot of fathers really struggle with, how am I supposed to do this? Moreover, stepping into that role of nurturer is one that our society kind of actively works against. So suddenly you're trying to do some things that for a long time you've been told you shouldn't be doing. So dads need to be aware of the fact that, yeah, this is a hard transition. And if you hit some bumps in the road, admitting that you're hitting those bumps and seeking out assistance is something that you should celebrate and, recognize as far as like, this is a strength that I can see that I need some help, instead of kind of continuing to flounder.
Thank you so much. Excellent points. At this time, our Georgia Parent Power team at QCC needs your feedback about this webinar. We are dropping the link in the chat for you to share your thoughts about today's program, and we appreciate any and all comments and thoughts. And at this point, if you have a question to ask, if you could please put it in the Q&A section if you have not already. We have these excellent resources here to provide us with guidance. And so I am going to turn it over to our friend Angie, who is going to pull the questions from the Q&A and ask our excellent panelists about their thoughts.
Hi there. Hi, I'm Angie Wilson, and I am the Family and Health Support Specialist at Quality Care for Children. And this has been so amazing. I have a 19-year-old and 15-year-old twins, and this just brings me back to a time where a lot of this is not spoken. And in Hispanic communities as well, we don't talk about sexual health at all. It's not talked about. So we do have a couple of questions that lead into this because a doula sounds amazing. I just think back, like, who cannot, who we need this. But it also the question is, why are we so far behind in the US in providing this type of service? Reading, Korea has just adopted this recently, having somebody come into the home and assist. And Germany has had this type of service for a very, very long time. What makes us so far behind?
I'll take a stab at that one. Culturally, we have this huge emphasis on independence and self-sufficiency. And we fail to sufficiently think about how the well-being of children is the foundation for the well-being of our community. We think of parenting and what goes on within the family as something that's very private and just consequential for the family. So we do not have a more collectivistic or group orientation. We do not think about how we need to intervene and uplift all family units. So I mean that orientation, in terms of that really individualistic orientation, is consequential in so many of our policy practices across the nation. And this is just one example, but that we can't let go of the idea that we have to be like these little independent individual soldiers that never stop to receive assistance or give assistance.
I'll also, emphasizing all of that and say, adding onto it, the US does have a very deep history of work against doulas and midwives that goes, really, really deep, ties into the creation of the American Medical Association. So if folks are curious about that, I definitely suggest, reading the literature of birth justice, of folks like Loretta Ross, who have done this work so diligently. But if we look at statistics of birthing, and maternal health in this country, they're actually worse now than they were during enslavement, which is a scary notion to think about. Right, there's so much that can be said about that, but just to think about, the work that other countries are doing and the ways that the U.S. is consistently, like Dr. Dugner Davis is mentioning, through policy and legislation, pushing us even further away, which is why, harm reduction, community models of support and care, doulas, midwives, OBGYNs who have, who hold this work as vulnerable and sensitive and not as a surgical business, make all the difference in the world when it comes to positive birth outcomes, as well as a difference of postpartum.
Thank you. The next question is, does postpartum affect single births differently than multiple births, natural versus C-section?
I don't know. Actually, that's a data point I'm not familiar with. I know that with multiple births, the babies do frequently tend to be more fragile. And so I would assume the stress is increased, and stress is obviously a predictor in terms of postpartum depression. But honestly, I don't know specific studies that have investigated that. I will, however, do some digging and send them to the parent services so that they can possibly put a link in the YouTube for this, because that's a really interesting question.
Our next question is, are there any natural remedies for postpartum depression? How does somebody take care of themselves holistically?
That's a great question. And, as someone who is a doula and also encouraging folks to work with your local community, definitely, right? So we call them Herbal Allies, right? And our plant medicines that can help support us. And so, things like ashwagandha that have been proven to help support stress relief, having diffusers with scents such as, lavender, eucalyptus, being intentional also, once again, going back to the point I made a little while ago about warming food. So thinking about even something that I'm really big on is emphasizing, what are the food of your culture, of your ancestors, right? What historically have people who look like you and have your living, what were you eating, right? And how can you get some of that nutrients back in your body? Salves and balms with herbs that, can help to soothe and ease pain are also, really, really great to have. And if that's something that folks are interested, I mean, Georgia has so many local community-based farmers and urban agriculture folks who sell fresh herbs, putting things like bay leaves in your soup to really make sure, you're getting that warming sensation in the body. So yeah, definitely lots of herbs, things like valerian as well. So definitely, I encourage folks that in addition to, getting a more medical, clinical support, if that's of interest to you, to, never forget about our plant friends and how much they can help to support us.
Thank you. The next question is, what is the typical age of the child that the mother or father start to transition out from postpartum depression? Or how many months or years is the normal span?
So postpartum depression, in terms of getting that specific terminology, can be diagnosed up to 1 year after the birth of the child. But as is the case with depression in general, there's a lot of variability in terms of how people exhibit symptoms, experience symptoms, and whether or not they experience a full reductions in symptoms. I mean, so in terms of the symptoms for postpartum depression, they really are not different than major depression. Okay, so this is a major depressive episode that happens kind of co-occurring with the birth. And that all of the variability that we see in terms of treatment outcomes for depression in general are relevant in the context of postpartum depression. Some people experience full remission of symptoms. Some people will have later episodes, later depressive episodes. So there can be a whole lot of variability.
My next question is, I would love a doula for birth or for post-birth, but they are all very expensive and my insurance doesn't cover it. Are there any resources for financial assistance, or are there low-cost doulas available?
Great point. I know folks at BMMA, also, who I'm wearing on my shirt today, have been doing a lot of work, especially with Blue Cross Blue Shield, trying to make doulas covered by insurance. But in the meantime, this is a resource that I gave the team that'll be sent out after. But System Midwife has a directory, as well as the National Black Doula Association, of community-based doulas. And I have yet to meet a doula, and I've been in this work, and immersed in this work in a while, who won't offer a payment plan. So be vocal, right? A part of being a doula is to be deeply rooted in community. And when people are immersed, they know the socioeconomic factors that their clientele are experiencing. And so I, negotiate and talk about a payment plan, or say where you are at financially. Many doulas offer sliding scale services. So that, to Dr. Dugner Davis's point about self-advocacy, that's where some of those kind of things come out. But I'm absolutely certain that, there's someone out there who can support you and the financial needs that you have. So check out when we send out that final email, Sister Midwife directory.
Thank you. A doula sounds amazing. I'm like overwhelmed. Like I'm keeping thinking like maybe I need a doula just for myself.
Well, there are birth doulas, death doulas, life doulas. So there's a doula for everything. So
okay, and this is going to be our last question. I am a future mental health counselor working on my master's and would love to work with this community. Are there any programs that I can work with this community or volunteer for?
Healthy mothers, healthy babies. Most definitely. I just happen to know we've had some of our graduate students work there. That's one off the top of my head. But any sort of like OBGYN practice should be able to refer you to resources in terms of therapists that they're referring their clients to. And that's, yeah, I'm stuttering because I'm like, oh, I didn't think of that question. And I'll try and put some more links in as far as places to intersect with this community. Ms. Excel might have a better.
No, echoing healthy mothers, healthy babies. Actually, as an undergraduate at Spelman College, I volunteered several times with them. So encourage that work. In Georgia, there's also Black Women's Health Imperative, BMMA, Sister Love Inc. And also, when you go to Black Mamas Matter Alliance website, they're a coalition, right? So there's over like 30 community-based organizations. And so I say reach out to those folks. As someone who, my master's degree is in social work with a, clinical health, mental health emphasis, and who's also I had to hodgepodge these things together. Because right to all of the points we've been making on the panel today, we don't create clear holistic pathways to be able to support parents and families. And so I say get creative, reach out to folks. If you see, a gap that you and your specific lens with health and mental health can infuse together, I say do it. That was so much of my master's experience was like, here's a health gap that we're missing, and here's how I can help support fill it. So I say reach out to people and kind of do cold calls and emails and just see who's out there.
Thank you both so much. It was excellent, and thank you to Ms. Angie Wilson for leading our Q&A section. For those of you in our audience today, we respect and honor your feedback at Quality Care for Children. If you look in the chat or on the screen, we've posted a link to a quick survey to get your insight about today's Georgia Parent Power webinar. We'll also email you a copy of the survey link immediately at our conclusion. Well, thank you to our panelists, and thank you so much to our sponsors, Carter's. You can see their adorable clothes on these precious children. We greatly appreciate their commitment to help nurture and protect children and to build communities in which children can thrive. As a reminder, we will send a follow-up email with the resources mentioned during this webinar and with a link to our survey. If you or any parents are seeking referrals for childcare after school care, please call our referral line at 877-ALL-GA-KIDS. That's 877-255-4254. A referral specialist will help you with care anywhere in the state. If you would like to get periodic texts on news and information related to your young child, sign up for our Georgia Parent Power text service. Text CARE, C-A-R-E, to 877-255-4254. Quality Care for Children is a nonprofit organization. If you would like to contribute to help us continue to provide great programs like this webinar to help every child reach their full potential, please visit us at qccdonate.org. Any contribution is much appreciated. We thank you so much for your time, and we thank our panelists for sharing their knowledge and the excellent discussion that we had today. We will see you again for our next Georgia Parent Power webinar. Please stay connected to QCC on your favorite social media platform. You can follow us at QCC Georgia. Thank you all so much. We really appreciate your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.